Welcome to the Never Too Early Fantasy Football Podcast, where it is never too early for fantasy football. My name is Jeff.
And I'm Alex.
Hey, Alex, how's it going today?
It's going well. We're just, 7 weeks away from football?
I'm applauding that for people that can't see the video. I am so pumped for football. Less than 50 days away. Let's go. Camps are opening. Preseason will be here before we know it. And as always, thank you for downloading, listening, liking, and commenting on our podcast videos. Please subscribe to us on the socials. We are on Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and now Threads with the handle at N2EFantasy. Alex, what do we have on today's show?
Well, today is our weekend news wrap up. So we have DeAndre Hopkins finally finds a team. We have 3 prominent running backs who were franchise tagged that we can discuss. We have some contract extensions and some pay cuts and some simping for Tom Brady going on. We have some running backs in New England news as well. We got Bill Belichick potentially on the hot seat, y'all. We have the Commanders' sale finalized officially that we can discuss. And we have a kicker cut by a team and a wide receiver trade. So let's go ahead and go into it. Let's start with the big news. DeAndre Hopkins signed with the Tennessee Titans. Jeff, I know we've talked about this for weeks, and it seemed like it was in the news a likely scenario, and it was one that I personally held out hope that it wouldn't happen, that he would go to a better team. But here we are, Jeff. What do you make of this deal?
So, this deal is the best deal that Hopkins could get. It's a 2-year deal with very obtainable incentives. Fantasy wise, I think that it's pretty much status quo at quarterback for him. I think Kyler Murray to Ryan Tannehill isn't much of a leap or a fall either way. And with all said and done, I know we're going to be talking about wide receivers in a future episode, but he's a wide receiver 2 for me right now. And he should be the target monster in Tennessee. And he actually makes their offense pretty competitive. They should be able to put up some serious points inside of that division. What are your thoughts on Mr. Hopkins finally picking a team?
I have a lot of thoughts here. So Tennessee's best offensive year wasn't last in 2020, and that's when they had AJ Brown and they had Corey Davis. AJ Brown went for 1,000 yards, and Corey Davis went for about 900 yards, and King Henry got 2,000 rushing yards. So that was their best statistical offensive year under Vrabel. And every year they've gone down since. Last year, of course, everyone knows was a huge struggle for them. This year they contemplated their best defensive back. They tried to get him to take a pay cut. There's rumors they tried to trade Tannehill to Atlanta in the middle of the draft. So neither of those worked out. So this seems like they pivoted from potentially retooling or rebuilding to buying into this season by going after Hopkins, who does feel a massive need for them at wide receiver. Hopkins has said that he would retire if he didn't get 1,000 yards. So I think that would be the baseline to look at with potentially a higher upside. He was on pace to get a good amount of stats last year, even with the Cardinals. And I think this is a weird situation for him because I think he's basically in the same situation he was in with the Cardinals, where he's going to be an offensive focal point, and they just aren't, in my opinion, going to be a good playoff team. They might not even make the playoffs, but he got his payday. So he went to the team that offered him the most money, and that was the decision he went with. It also happens to have a nice nightlife in Nashville, which I think is very important to a player like Hopkins. So it makes sense, and it's good for fantasy owners. I agree with you on the wide receiver too, price tag and where he should be valued. I do think that there is a higher upside if this offense starts clicking a little bit more and Tannehill throws a little bit more than he has the past couple seasons. You could see Hopkins get to the 1,200s. You could see him get to potentially the 1,400s, which would be on the high side, but it's possible. So it's a good place for him for fantasy purposes, maybe not so much real football purposes, but they're trying to swing, which to me, I know I've been low on Tennessee overall, but to me, it gets them to probably the 7-10, 8-9 range on their win-loss record. if their defense improves. I know they were banged up last year, so maybe if they're healthy, maybe that knocks them up to a 9-8 situation, and they might sneak into the end of playoffs or just miss it. That's basically my whole thought on that. I'm still annoyed though.
So out of all of that, I took that we need to have a pivot drop for our podcast here
Yeah,
because you
that's
said,
something that we can talk about. Yeah, updates on how things have changed since we last.
all right. So pivoting onto the next topic, the franchise tag extension deadline was this past Monday, and the deadline passed with a whimper for running backs. What do you see the future for Barkley, Jacobs, and Pollard?
Well, Pollard was never going to get a deal because he has to prove that one, he can stay healthy, and two, he can take the full workload. And I think he understood that. That's why he signed his deal so fast. Barkley and Jacobs, understandably upset. They're two of the biggest focal points for their offense, and they didn't get a realistic contract in their eyes, even though I think the Giants threw a lot of money at Barkley, probably not enough guaranteed money, though. So Jacobs has been fairly quiet. I'm not 100% sure on where he's at this moment, but he doesn't have much to play for, seemingly from the outside's perspective, with the Raiders looking kind of poor. Barkley, on the other hand, I know you've pointed out that he is the best offensive weapon that they have, and he knows it. He's made several comments that his leverage now is to try to sit out and make them hurt a little bit, and he's contemplating doing that. And he's even in an interview dressed up like Le'Veon Bell in the classic Bumblebee Pittsburgh uniform, which is the striped black and yellow, while he made those comments. So that's very interesting. I don't know if that was intentional, but it seemed intentional. So a holdout seems very likely, at least for Barkley, probably for both Barkley and Jacobs. What's your take on that?
So Pollard, I completely agree with you. He was never going to be a long-term guy in Dallas. I wonder if they regret putting the franchise tag on him. I don't see him being like a bell cow back, and that is going to be an issue for the Cowboys as they enter this season. Whether you thought he was good, not good, Zeke was definitely a bell cow back and could carry that ball 20 times a game. And while some of them were ineffective on the stat sheet, every time that you run that football up the gut 20 times a game, you are weakening that defense every single play. And you're making it easier for players like Pollard that are fast to have holes and face a worn down defense. So I don't know if they have that pounder to kind of like wear down that defense anymore. It can't be Pollard. Pollard definitely can't be it. This is going to be a long season, and I don't know if I love the running back depth behind Pollard. So switching to the other two backs, I think Jacobs has the most to sit out for because his team's not good. He's still young. Why take hits for a bad team? I think every GM will understand that once he hits the free market next year. Like they're going to be like, well, thank you very much for keeping some of that tread on the tires. I know you'll give your all now that you've got your long term with guaranteed money contract. I think that he has the most to gain by sitting out and the most to lose by actually playing because he has risks injury every time that he plays and he risks playing for a bad team. So he risks playing with 8 guys in the box and he risks his stats coming down drastically this year, to be honest. Moving on to Barkley. Barkley said in his interview that he has leverage to sit out, but he doesn't know if he can sit out. So that tells me that he's having a moral dilemma in his head. And it's something that will play out over the next 7 weeks, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. 7 weeks until the season starts. And I don't think Jacobs or Barkley show up to anything in the preseason. I'm talking about camp, I'm talking about preseason. The earliest they show up is probably the week before week 1. In my eyes, this is very smart and it could have a risk side to it as well. It's very smart because they risk not getting injured at all. Or there's no risk to getting injured at all for them at this point. So that is basically where we're at with them. Why it might be a little stupid is they're not going to be used to getting hit. I think running backs get that, like, you know how people get calluses on their hands and stuff. This is kind of very similar to what happens with running backs in the preseason and camp. They get used to being hit by players, not like tackled, but like hit. So they're gonna
with
miss
that
out on
physical
that.
contact.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
you need that.
there's the risk.
Yeah. I just think, man, for these guys personally, I think the best thing they could do is sign the deal and then fake an injury and not play until their team gets the message. And that way they don't get fined. They get their full money because it's fully guaranteed. That's really the only move that they can make at this point because they are not allowed to negotiate a contract since they're past the deadline. So that's really all they can do. Outside of that, I know that there's another player that did get a contract extension from a franchise tag, but he is the tight end Evan Ingram with Jacksonville. And he might be someone that maybe it's not that smart to give a contract to because in the past he's gotten money and then fizzled out once he's got his cash. So he might be the poster boy of why you don't pay these guys that kind of money and give them 1 year deals. Jeff, what do you think that's a smart move with Jacksonville? Do you think there's a risk there of him not performing to his highest now that he's got his cash? What do you think with Evan Ingram?
So I think with Evan, his contract is a 3-year deal, so it's a shorter term deal. And I think with his new deal that the first 2 years are basically fully guaranteed. 24 million of it is guaranteed. What that looks like is it's really just a 2-year deal. I know that he's not someone that we want to give a long-term deal to, but 2-year deal really isn't a long-term deal. I think that he will perform well with his second year with Trevor Lawrence, which I do believe is the best quarterback that he's ever played with. I know he played with a couple of the Giants quarterbacks, but one was a rookie, one was coming to the end of his career. So I do think Trevor Lawrence now hitting full stride, I think might be the best quarterback that Evan Ingram ever played with.
You
And
think
I
he's
do,
better than Eli Manning?
at that point, yeah. Eli was definitely end of the career, and that's the year after where they drafted Daniel Jones. So I
You don't
think
think
that
Daniel Jones is better than Lawrence?
I guess everyone will have to tune in to next episode where we break down our quarterback rankings because I will talk probably about one, maybe both of them.
Well, we've talked about someone not getting any money at all. We've talked about someone getting an extension. Well, why don't we talk about Joe Mixon, who took a pay cut to stay with Cincinnati? I know with a running back situation that we're in right now, where they don't seem to be getting paid what they think they're worth, taking a pay cut rather than getting outright cut. Do you think that was a smart move for him? Do you think he could have gotten more in the open market? What do you think about the Joe Mixon situation?
So I think if he would have went to the open market, he would have been competing with Cook for maybe one spot, and really that would have really hampered his ability to negotiate, and it would have hampered both players' ability to negotiate because they would have been negotiating against each other. Because I think they're kind of in the same basket of type of player and where they're at in their career. He did take the pay cut to try to compete for the championship, and it's actually a pretty steep pay cut. I think he's making less than $6 million this year, which is actually a pretty steep pay cut for him. I also believe that this was the only way forward for the Bengals because they don't really have anything behind Mixon. Now, someone could argue that they would go out and sign Leonard Fournette, or they would go out and sign Kareem Hunt, Ezekiel Elliott, but I don't know if anyone knows the system as well as Mixon does. And I think that Mixon and Burrow have like this great chemistry going, and he's kind of like a safety blanket for Burrow. So I think that it was the best place for both Mixon and the Bengals. I'm just surprised that he took as big of a pay cut as he did.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about this. I don't think Mixon's a world beater kind of running back. I do think he's pretty good, and I think that he's good for the system. He has gotten more efficient and more explosive per touch each season that he's been with the Bengals. The 6 million is basically the base value for him. He's getting to where he can get up to 8 million total with incentives over the next 2 years, so 8 million each year potentially. So it's not that steep, but it was, I mean, essentially like a third of his pay was cut, and that's pretty big for anybody. but he's still getting a relatively competitive deal. It might be still a little bit on the cheap side. However, they're trying to build a championship roster. They've got Burrow. They've got three really good wide receivers. Two of them are very, very good. They're trying to stay competitive, and he knows that they're very close to winning a Super Bowl. There's no other situation that would be better for him. I agree with you that from Cincy's point, there's no running back right now that they could reasonably bring in and have already up to speed, that already knows the system, that also is a talented running back on top of that. And that really shows with how long they kept negotiating rather than doing what Minnesota did and cut Dalvin Cook rather quickly. So they were in the same boat, and Minnesota cut bait really fast, whereas Cincinnati kept negotiating and they finally agreed on something, which is a good sign for Mixon this year. And he still has another year. So it really opens the door for them having him for 2 years and really going for that Super Bowl window. So I think it's a win-win right now. Obviously, yes, you'd prefer to get paid more, but he's still making more than what Dalvin is right now, which is only the 2 million that Minnesota still owes him.
Right, absolutely. And I think, as you said, I think the big thing out of this deal was the 2 years. And I don't think people understand how important that is, because now they have Mixon under control for 2 years at a reasonable salary. And it pretty much guarantees that he sticks around next year as long as he's decent this year. So I think this is like there's like a window for Mixon, and then obviously there's a window with the Bengals. Their window will be open at least some length as long as Joe Burrow is the quarterback there. Now, as we know, the big thing next year is going to be how they fit those three wide receivers under the salary and Burrow's new contract. And I do think that that becomes more challenging and more challenging and more challenging. And you have to take assets away from the defense and other aspects of football to pay these guys. So at some point it becomes a zero sum game, and you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and it doesn't usually work that well. And at the end of the day, the quarterback is supposed to be the one that like lifts all the other boats around them. So maybe a new wide receiver would come in and Burrow would be able to develop chemistry and make him into a Pro Bowler as well. So sometimes it's not about paying the wide receiver or the running back in this case.
All right. Well, Antoine Winfield Jr. has come out and said the Buccaneers are still actively recruiting Tom Brady to come back, which I really can't blame them for, but man, they're still simping after their ex. Come on, man. What do you make of this?
So again, I don't blame them. They would love for him to come back. The door will always be open. I think there's nothing but love there after he brought them a Super Bowl. So I think the door will always be open. We also have the Raiders ownership pending, so we'll see where that goes and when that gets finalized. And lastly, I have not removed Tom Brady from any of my sheets yet. I've learned my lesson last year, so I am going to wait until the week before the season starts before I remove him, and that's my decision.
Well, he's moved on to bigger and better things. He's moved on to potential ownership. Jeff, I don't know if he's coming back anymore. So that's all I have to say about that. But speaking of ownership, Josh Harris has officially been sworn in on the Gutenberg Bible with his hand held up as the new owner for the Washington, whatever they're going to be called, team. And everybody's happy except for maybe Dan Snyder. But everyone else, all the other owners, Jerry Jones has already went up the escalator and somebody asked him a question. It's a good day for football. And all the fans there that have been protesting for years to get him to sell the team, everybody in Washington has got to be happy with this.
Yeah, and I think this is just an overall positive front for the whole organization, and it just breeds hope for the future. Again, we've talked about this before. We don't know if and how long they'll be called the Commanders for, because I don't believe they own the trademark for that. So that'll be one thing to watch out for early on in this transition. We're going to be looking at quarterback. We're going to be looking at head coach. We're probably going to be looking at GM. They'll probably all change because as we know, like when a new owner comes in, they like to get the lay of the land, and then they like to bring in their guys. But it does sound like he's very dedicated in his ways to try to get a championship to Washington, and he says his legacy is going to be this team. So I know he's owned other teams before, but he understands the importance and the gravitas of owning an NFL team. Like, this will be the number one thing that gets put on his tombstone at the end of his days, like NFL owner. So before NBA owner or any other organization that he owns. So he does understand that this is probably the most important accomplishment that he could do is win a championship in the NFL.
Well, he already kicked Dan Snyder out the door, so he's already starting off on the right foot.
I mean, good riddance to bad rubbish, and it's just time for Mr. Snyder to go. The report came out today that he harassed employees and he withheld revenue from teams and he did all sorts of unethical stuff in his time as owner. And honestly, I won't miss him one bit. He doesn't add any value to the league. He's not entertaining like Jerry Jones. So he didn't really add value. He actually took away a lot of value and he made it a much more hostile place for employees to work. So
He
good
also was
riddance.
given the highest fine I think the NFL's ever given anyone, and it was $60 million while he's getting shoved out the door.
Well,
60 million.
I understand that, but so from the NFL's perspective and from Snyder's perspective, he's getting 6.05 billion to sell his team. What's a little 60 million cash on the way out? Like,
A little 1%, little
it,
1% tip.
yeah. So not a big deal for him, but
Be a big
still,
deal for me. I'll take some
yeah,
of that, Dan.
right? Should distribute it to NFL fans.
There you go.
Does that 60 million go into the league's revenue for this year and affect the salary cap for next year?
It does not. It goes to executives' pockets.
Darn it. Hey, it was
If
worth a
anything, it
shot.
should go back to Josh Harris because he has to pay the bill that Dan Snyder should have been paying this whole time.
Yep.
All right. Well, Hall of Fame head coach Bill Belichick is on the hot seat in New England because he doesn't have Tom Brady anymore. What do you uh what do you make of this? Do you think he'll struggle again this year, or do you think he'll right the ship?
This year is going to be a really close to 500 year, and I don't know if it's going to be enough for Bill to keep his job. I just don't see the firepower that Miami, the Jets, and the Bills have, and I don't see. There's a chance. There's a greater than not chance that they actually finish in last place. If they finish in last place, he's definitely gone. And I know there were rumors out there that they might offer him like a front office position, but he hasn't even been that good of a GM either. So I think that's just a rumor, just speculation, just trying to save face around the building with Bill Belichick. I honestly don't know if it's a bad thing that he'd be leaving. I think it might be time for new blood. I think the last few years have shown how good of a coach Andy Reid is versus how good of a coach Bill Belichick is, because Andy Reid has been able to flourish under multiple systems, multiple teams, multiple quarterbacks, and even Alex Smith. They were a high seeded playoff team when they sat him in the last week of the year for Mahomes to get his first start. It's not just Mahomes. Mahomes might have put him over the hump, but Andy Reid had them there consistently before Mahomes got there. It's crazy now to look back and just see how Andy Reid's evolved over time and Bill Belichick hasn't.
Yeah, Bill Belichick increasingly looks more and more like a mediocre coach, which if you said that 3 years ago, you would get shouted down because everyone thinks Bill Belichick's one of the greatest coaches of all time. But without Tom Brady, he is a 500 coach, maybe below 500 coach, which is mind-boggling that that would be the case. But so far it is. Now this year he's off on a better foot than last year because he actually hired an offensive coordinator that knows how to coach offense rather than a defensive coordinator and Joe Judge co-splitting the offensive coordinator duties. Well,
Agreed.
if he actually brought in a wide receiver that was worth something, maybe they would turn that around. Like Hopkins, if they offered him the same deal that Tennessee did, maybe Hopkins would have gone to the Patriots, and that would have helped their entire offense. But so far, it seems like his past success was having Tom Brady and then recruiting people like Randy Moss, like trading for Randy Moss, trading for Wes Welker, having someone like Edelman kept their team afloat, and they don't have those kind of wide receivers, and they certainly don't have someone like Tom Brady at quarterback.
That's the big one. The last one that you said is the big one. The rest of them, I think, were brought up by Tom Brady's success, and he made
Randy
a bunch of.
Moss,
Moss was like a 2-year blip out of Brady's 20-year career there. I know that
Edelman,
Moss
Wes
was different.
Welker, come on, man. Edelman and Wes Welker were really, really good too. It's
They
not
were
just Brady. Brady maximized them, but they
yeah,
were
and
also good.
and they were also Brady's type of wide receiver. He loved that slot receiver, and that's why they went after Danny Amendola also, and why he clicked so well with Chris Godwin in Tampa. So I think Tom Brady's receiver of choice was that slot receiver, and I think Edelman and Welker both flourished with it. I think Amendola flourished a little bit with it, but he only joined him towards the end of his career. So
Well, speaking of New England, Leonard Fournette visited New England, potentially could sign. I think it's the first visit for him. I know they brought in a lesser running back like Daryl Henderson as well, but obviously someone like Leonard Fournette gets the headlines. So, do you think he ends up signing there? What would that mean for the running back stable? What do you think?
oh boy, I don't know what New England's doing at running back because they flirted with Cook. They are now flirting with Fournette, but it does seem also like they have a full and loaded backfield. I know you are not. There's a lot of unproven commodities back there, and Pierre Strong, and I think it's Kevin Harris. Basically, obviously, they have Stevenson as well. I think he's going on social media as Steven Season.
That's good. That's good.
Can't
That's good. I like
gotta
it.
have some punny jokes in here. I do think Fournette is a version of Stevenson. I do think that if they brought Fournette in, it would be to take the 30% that or the 35% that Stevenson can't take and like lighten his workload a little bit. But I do think Stevenson would be the one and the one that would get the majority of the carries. And then I think Fournette and I think Cook sees this as well. Like he's not going to get the accolades that he would want to get. So I don't think that he would want to sign with New England either. But Fournette knows that he's towards the end of his career. He's not getting that many visits, and he's 28 years old. And I could easily see Fournette signing with the Patriots on a 1-year deal. Not too much money, and he would kind of replace James Robinson's spot on the roster.
Yeah, I think Leonard Fournette is the type of veteran player that Belichick likes. I think he would be a good complement to Stevenson, and I think that makes sense. He reminds me of LeGarrette Blount, and they obviously had LeGarrette Blount for a time in New England. I do like the name Steven Season. I got to tell my friend Steven to make sure he names his fantasy football team this year Steven Season. I think that would be pretty good, and maybe draft Stevenson as well. So. But I think that it would be a smart move for New England, especially at a time when running back contracts are at their lowest, to go ahead and bring in another person. Obviously, they're not bringing in wide receivers, so might as well bring in a running back as well if they're trying to be a run first offense and take some pressure off of Mac Jones.
There's really nothing left on the wide receiver market to bring in right now, so I think that's part of the problem. Like there's Jarvis Landry, but he's like a huge slot guy. Tom Brady would love that. Um, Galladay's out there, Julio Jones, like a bunch of what feels like washed up wide receivers are out there.
I think they should go after Cole Beasley. Allegedly, it's not on our list, but allegedly, Cole Beasley received interest from a mystery team.
What does that mean?
I don't
Any
know.
any ideas of who would it be?
What team would make more sense than the Patriots? What team has used a certain type of slot wide receiver more than the Patriots?
That was a
Makes sense.
Bradyism, though.
Was it though, or was it a Belichickism?
I don't think Belichick was throwing the football.
No, but Belichick thinks he's smarter than everybody else.
He's never drafted a wide receiver that's actually been successful, so
Didn't he
I
draft
don't
Edelman?
really trust him to do that. To
I think he
draft it,
drafted Edelman.
I believe that you might be right, but I am checking that out. Yeah, he did draft Edelman in the
In
7th
your
round.
face, Jeff.
In the
In
7th
your
round, though,
face.
so he didn't even know what he had when he drafted him.
Well, maybe he did, Jeff. Maybe he's such a genius. He knew. He
So,
knew he was getting great value in the 7th round.
so here's the thing: like all these
You're
first
right.
and second round receivers that he's failed on, he backed into a 7th round receiver that turned into a Hall of Famer, and I would dare to say that's more on Edelman than it is on any coaching staff or Brady or anything for him to actually put in the work as a 7th rounder to be a Hall of Famer.
Jeff. Belichick is a once in a generation genius. He knew Tom Brady was going to be a Hall of Fame quarterback that was going to get him Thanos number of rings. He knew Edelman was going to be amazing. He's never missed in his life. He's never drafted like a N'Keal Harris or in whatever N'Keal Harry who was terrible. He's never done that. No, he's never made a bad decision, Jeff. Like dressing up
Um,
as a pirate for Halloween. He's never made a bad decision.
no, it's really funny that you're saying this because we both know if we went back to the Brady draft, Brady would be the 1.01, and like if we were revisiting and redrafted today. And then we also know that Edelman would probably be a first rounder today if they redrafted his draft. So really
Only
interesting.
Yeah, you should only give Bill Belichick 6th and 7th round picks, apparently.
Right? I don't even know how or why that is on like this trajectory, but he really doesn't do good drafting early weapons. And if you remember, his last two like major big free agent pickups were the two tight ends outside of this year when they spent money on Juju. So
Yeah. If you only gave him 6th and 7th round picks and he traded all his other stuff for current veterans, he'd actually be a very good GM. But that's not how the NFL works, and that's not what he would do. But yeah, he struggles with 1st and 2nd round picks.
yeah, did you? So here's an example of that draft of Edelman. So they took Edelman in the 7th round, pick 232. If we rewind the draft a little bit, his 3rd round pick at pick 83 was Brandon Tate, wide receiver out of North Carolina. Do you even know who Brandon Tate is?
I know who he is, but only because he kept getting confused with Ben Tate, who was a running back for the Texans at the time. That's the only reason.
Right. So you can kind of see my point there that it's he drafted a worse receiver ahead of Edelman, and like if he knew what he was doing, he would have took Edelman there if he knew what he was getting.
Or he would have taken someone better than Brendan Tate
Yeah,
at
that's
that.
pretty disgusting. Brandon Tate in the 3rd round, and then Edelman in the 7th round. What it makes Brandon Tate just look completely terrible and inept. So
Mhm.
just interesting things that I'm noticing along the way. That was also the draft. That was a really bad wide receiver draft. Austin Collie, Percy Harvin came out in that draft. Was a 1st rounder.
Yeah.
Hakeem Nicks, Darius Hayward Bay draft. Michael
Is
Crabtree,
that Macklin and Kenny?
Wallace.
What's his face?
Yep,
Was
Wallace and
Macklin
Kenny Britt.
Kenny Britt? Yep.
You are a draft guru because you're doing this right off of the top of your head, and I'm actually looking and doing research as we do this. So
I just
I'm
remember,
impressed.
so that draft, it was like Hakeem Nicks and Macklin and Kenny Britt were the three wide receivers that people were debating if they're going to be the first one taken. And obviously, I think Percy Harvin was really the best one of that group, and he wasn't even one of the three that people were mentioning. They thought of him as more of a return guy. But of the three, I think Macklin was probably the best of the three that I mentioned. But they were all outshined by Edelman, which is pretty crazy. Which goes to show you it's not just Bill Belichick who's bad at his job. There's a lot of people that are bad at their jobs out there.
That is very true. And as we said, Bill Belichick might be out of a job because he's been bad at his job recently.
Yep. Well, we've talked about 6th and 7th round picks, and we've talked about failed wide receivers that were taken too early. Denzel Mims, former Baylor wide receiver, was traded from the New York Jets with a crowded wide receiver room to the Detroit Lions, who seemed like they really, really needed an X type wide receiver to complement what they have. So it's a conditional 6th round pick with the Jets sending a 7th back to Detroit. I think this is a pretty smart, low risk move for Detroit. I think Mims was a 2nd round pick, so he's still very talented. Jeff, what do you make of this trade?
Ooh, I'm a little shocked that there was a trade because we were told that he was going to be released earlier yesterday. And I think that they did that so they could try to drum up trade interest. And the reason why he didn't hit the wire yesterday is because they had enough trade interest in order to keep him for one more day. I mean, honestly, there's no real reason why they needed to release him on July 19th versus July 20th, 21st, 22nd. Like there's no like need to release him. Like so I think they cleverly like let it out there that they were considering it or they were going to do it, and they got a trade offer from at least one team, and I think we heard about a second team that was interested in him as well. And as you said, second round pick, kind of a big deal for a second round pick that really never got a shot with the Jets. And you might argue with me and everything like that he could have somehow hit the field and everything like that, but I don't think the coaching staff liked him. And he very quickly played for a coaching staff that didn't draft him, which I know we talk about that often. It does really matter if new coaching staff comes in and they don't want to play the players that were already there because it's not their players. I think Corey Davis got signed quickly after that. And so I think he's had a lot of circumstances that have been against him. If he can hit the ground running here, this would give Detroit a lot of options as weapons, especially after week 6 when the suspension of Jamison Williams is lifted. So basically, what that would look like is it would give the Lions, it would give them Goff throwing to either St. Brown or to Williams or to Mims. And I do believe Mims and Williams are outside receivers. And I do believe St. Brown is an inside or a slot receiver. It just fits their offense so good. And then they have Marvin Jones and they have Josh Reynolds coming off the bench. Like they have enough, they have a crazy amount of firepower, especially for Jared Goff, that makes them. I've got my eye on them a little bit more now because I do think they drafted a good tight end to replace Hawkinson. I think that they've made all of the right moves to take the next step. They got rid of Swift. They brought in Gibbs. Gibbs and Swift are pretty close in talent. Hopefully, Gibbs can be a more healthier Swift. And then they brought in Montgomery as a pounder. Like this was a really good off season for them, and if they don't really take the leap forward here, then I'm going to be side eyeing why they didn't take a leap forward with the offense that they built. I know Mims isn't that big of a deal right now, but he could be.
Yeah, I've really been a fan of the Lions. I really for many Thanksgivings, I've watched them as the underdog in every matchup, basically, that they played at Thanksgiving, and I've kind of rooted for them to succeed because they've never won a Super Bowl. They've always been one of the doormat teams, other than a few years with Stafford. So I really enjoyed them having success this past season, and I agree with you, their offseason has been phenomenal. So when you look at the team, you look at, like you said, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who is a very, very good slot. He's a move slot, so he's more heavily featured than slot typically is. And you have Marvin Jones, who will start as the vertical wide receiver while Williams is on suspension. I don't know how it shakes out between those two, who gets more playing time. Probably Williams, since he's the younger and more talented one. But they're both really good for the vertical option. And now they have been missing that X wide receiver, that bigger target, the contested catch, the red zone guy. They've missed that position, and they got one on the cheap who has been talented. He's still very young, so he could be a very prominent piece. But let's not forget that in the draft they took Sam Laporta at tight end, who is also another good big target that they can use at tight end. Like you said, they virtually upgraded from Swift, who also had trouble staying healthy, but they upgraded from Swift to Gibbs, who I think is a better running back, and he's a lot closer to a McCaffrey type than I think Swift was. And I obviously McCaffrey's a special back, and I don't think anyone will get 100% to his level, but they've compared him to Kamara, so they've compared Gibbs to Kamara already, and I think that's a good comparison. I think he's a little bit faster than Kamara. They have all of these weapons now, and that's just on the offense. They've improved their offensive line. I think Goff has proved that he's still a pretty good quarterback, and I think he's been more efficient with Detroit than he was with LA, even with McVay. I think this is a team that clearly they are the best team in the NFC North. I think they're a playoff team. And Jeff, I know you mocked me for my win-loss projections for Detroit, but it's looking pretty good to me right now. I think that they are a team to watch in a not so great NFC conference to potentially go pretty far in the playoffs and maybe Detroit make it to the Super Bowl this year.
Yeah, and I know that coming up closer to the season, we're going to do a final standings for 2023, and we're going to kind of redo that episode and revisit with all the news and everything that we've gotten so far. So it will be another podcast that's coming up soon. We have a lot of good topics coming up soon.
Everything we do is great, Jeff.
It is.
Everything.
But I'm really excited now that we're going to be getting into the meat of fantasy because it's never too early.
It's never too early. That's right. So, in a corresponding move with this Mims trade, we have the Detroit Lions cutting Michael Badgley, their previous kicker. But let's not forget that they did acquire Riley Patterson in an earlier trade that we did cover. So they do have someone there too.
They do, and I think that they upgraded a kicker too. I think I like everything that they've done this offseason. So I
It's
just
been
think,
phenomenal.
yep, Jacksonville was ready to move off of him, and it was just time because they did bring in McManus. So I think Jacksonville also upgraded. So I think that I think both of those teams are kind of mirroring each other in like a little bit different ways, but I think their trajectories are mirroring each other.
Could we have a Jacksonville Jaguars Detroit Lions Super Bowl?
In London, maybe.
I know, I was just thinking that too.
Hey,
I mean, they're both improving, so we'll see how far they can take it this year.
absolutely. Stranger things have happened.
That's right. Okay, that does it for another amazing episode of the Never Too Early Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you all for listening and downloading this episode. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Please leave us a comment and share the show. Every little bit helps.
As always, you can find us with our handle at N2EFantasy on Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and now Threads. Please give us a follow. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, it's truly never too early for fantasy football. Thank you again.
Bye, everybody.